This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and community in which you now reside.
My full name and
Community in which you now reside.
Tom Kline, Eastham, Mass.
Where did you grow up?
Quincy, Massachusetts, on the South Shore.
In your teenage years, what activities did you participate
In high school, track and field, football, and basketball.
Did you enlist in the military or were you drafted?
I took a commission in ROTC from Boston University. My father was very upset that I joined the Army because he was in the Navy, and he gave me the devil because I didn't go in the Navy.
How old were you and why did you enlist?
My family had always been in the military somewhere, and I thought it was the right thing to do at the time. And the ROTC program at BU was available, which allowed me to choose what I wanted to do as opposed to being drafted and being told what I would like to do.
How did you mentally and physically prepare to go to war?
Physically prepared? I was a physical education major, so I always worked out. Used to run, lift weights, took martial arts. And that was part of a challenge, but it was personally a way of me living.
At what point in the war were you deployed?
I was deployed. I graduated from BU in 1964. I was put on active duty in March of 1965. And from there, my first assignment was Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in confinement. I walked in for the assignment, and they said, hello, goodbye. 2 months from now, you're going to Vietnam. So I was only there for a very short period of time. And from that point, I went to Fort Hood, Texas. We had 2 months to get a unit together of 120 men, a quarter of a ton, a deuce and a half, and a water trailer. Get them trained, certified, and ready to go to Vietnam. At that point, we shipped out to Oakland, California, and aboard the USS Breckenridge, a World War II troop ship. 2,500 Marines and 120 military police spent 22 days on the ship going to Vietnam.
What jobs and responsibilities did you have as a member of the Army?
I was a platoon leader, and military police originally dealt with military police activities such as confinement facilities, town patrol, enforcement of military law, criminal investigation. But in Vietnam, we were sent to Vietnam with the assumption that we were going to be prisoner of war processing. And when we got to Vietnam, we found out that nobody knew we were coming, and also found out that under a Geneva treaty, we could not process Asian prisoners of war. They had to be turned over to the Vietnamese or the Koreans. As a result, they hunted for about a month trying to find out what to do with us, and we ended up, before the Navy got in, we ended up doing harbor patrol. And after that, we did road patrol, reconnaissance, convoy escort north toward Route 1 going north.
How did you entertain yourself during the time you weren't fighting?
How did I entertain myself? Good question. I guess I tried to keep track of the moment. And, you know, people ask me, have you ever shot at anybody? I lost one person in the very beginning on Harbor Patrol. And when somebody shoots at you, you stop thinking, you just fire back. Fortunately, on road patrol, we drew fire a number of times, but it was always small arms fire. And they'd fire a few shots, we'd call in for support, air support. Usually it didn't show up. Maybe it would last about an hour. Somebody would be shooting or sniper shots, but they weren't very good. And you quickly learn that somebody's shooting at you, you want to shoot back. So it's, you know, a natural instinct. Our weaponry at the time was basically end of World War II, Korean War weaponry, so we weren't very far advanced as far as the weapons we used. And at the time we were there were about 10,000 troops in Vietnam. Mostly of them were at that time were advisors. They were out in the Delta or in the Highlands. And as a result of that, we hadn't put a lot of troops on the ground, and then they decided it was time to start building up the forces. And we were at 10,000 troops. We were the first group of troops that was sent in. So it was a real adjustment for everybody in the chain of command, how to operate. Unfortunately, with our success in World War II, with Germany and Japan and Korea, excuse me, we thought because we were so victorious and responded to warfare so quickly that we were going to fight the battles in Vietnam the same way they fought them in that time frame. And as it turned out, that was the biggest mistake that I feel that this country made, because the Viet Cong didn't fight like the Germans and the Japanese. They'd get you, start firing and try to draw you in, and then they'd retreat right away. So you were never in a position where you were, you know, doing a lot of damage to the enemy. And then they started, well, once they draw you in, they started setting up ambushes, which wasn't how most of the American troops were trained to fight. I was very fortunate. My unit was involved with one of the major operations at the time, and it was called Operation Masher in the White Wing. And I guess back home, excuse me, the term masher was very offensive to the politicians and to the government who were people who were protesting. So they changed the name to Operation White Wing and eliminated the term masher. It was one of the first successful operations. If at that time they decided, and wrongfully, they decided to count victory by head count, how many people were killed. And a lot of times the head count would, you know, be 7 Vietnamese to 1 American. And what we found later on, I found later on, is a lot of the head count were made by people who wanted to look good, and they would falsify the numbers so that it always showed that while we were winning the war, until later in the war they found out, well, that wasn't the truth. Although I can say that from my information, we never lost a battle on the ground because we were winning battles with air support helicopters, which weren't in World War II. But the body counts, the number of people on both sides that were killed, especially the civilian population, was horrendous. War is an awful, awful thing. If you're going to fight, I guess you have to make the commitment and go after it, but it's not something.
Do you have any heroic stories?
No, I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a hero.
How do you think you affected the people of Vietnam?
Fortunately, like I said, I was there. My whole company was basically volunteers, and most of them were young men. Probably I was 21. They were maybe 18, and a good number of them had volunteered. A good number were college, 1-2 year college, and they volunteered. And times were different. People felt at that time that if your country called you, it was time to, to stand up and be counted. So I had a high morale with the troops. Troops supported us. I guess that's, I was never a hero. I mean, I did what I was told and did it to the best of my ability. And it was strange. What I think Americans didn't understand is that if you look at the history of Vietnam, the French raped the country. They took it over like it was a colonization. They wanted to make it Vietnam like Britain had made Hong Kong. And in the process, the Vietnamese people had come to this country. Matter of fact, Ho Chi Minh came to Boston and worked as a waiter and tried to get the United States, although he was looking towards communist, he went to the United States and asked for support, and they would just ignored him because of the fact that he was an Asian, and that what brought us into the war was that China and Russia were sending large amounts of aid to Ho Chi Minh. And basically, he wanted a national Vietnam. He wasn't concerned as much about communism as he was, but he didn't get any support from the United States. And the Vietnamese people were basically farmers, and the communists knew how to take advantage of that through a number of different operations that they had. My sentiments, I mean, like I said before, what I didn't know back then was that it was my duty to go and serve my country. I think we could have served our country and done it in a better way. The amount of graft, they had what they call a hamlet, where they took the people from their villages. They people lived in their houses with their families. And that what was important to them was their ancestors who grew up and lived on that land. And we went in, not my unit, tore the villages down, burned them down, picked the people up, displaced them, and moved them into small little hamlets that we thought we could control the flow of the communists. And the people, instead of supporting us, resented the fact that we have taken them from their ancestral grounds. There was a lot of political decisions, and not just the politics, but the military leadership that was never been on the ground. They had never been in hand-to-hand combat. They'd never been in with the people of Vietnam. They had a pacification program where hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on bringing, food and drink and machinery to the Vietnamese, to find out that the people that were getting it were selling it as opposed to dispersing it to the population. There were things that went on that we should have known about but never bothered to check up. The people wanted to go in and just, it still bothers me. That bothers me. I mean, I look at my kids, and if that had happened with me here, I'd be just like the Vietnams. you know. Anyway.
How did you feel coming back from the war?
I was glad to come home because things were really starting to get bad after the last part. We were getting more involved. There were thousands of troops that were being brought over who were ground infantry. At that time, the helicopters had just started to come in, and in World War II, the average troop was in combat maybe 20 days in a month or half year, whatever it is, for the same period of time, whatever the time frame was. The average ground troop in Vietnam was in combat, physical combat with his life on the line, 240 days compared to what the ground troops were doing in World War II. And I can say that the doctors and nurses were incredible. They were out in the field. We were close to the evac hospitals. When we came back in from the field, we'd be close to the evac hospitals. And they were working 24/7, doing everything they could do. My first casualty, he had just been put on a ship for harbor patrol where you would take a hand grenade and you'd throw the hand grenades over the side of the ship. And that would keep the divers away from the boats because they couldn't get in close to the harbor. And he was a 19-year-old kid. His name was Dennis Guy Harmon. And he pulled the pin on the grenade and it went off in his hand. I spent 2 days in the hospital with him. He lost both arms. His face was like an orange basketball. And he passed away. And we did an investigation. It doesn't show you on the documentation, but we did an investigation. There was a whole box of World War II or Korean War hand grenades that were defective, a whole box. And if you look on it, and I can show you the sheet, it lists on the wall. You look up his name. It says killed in action. And then it says friendly fire. Where if you look on the people who are killed in action, it lists automatic weapons. It lists the enemy, what the enemy had done. But here it says friendly fire. I think of his parents on a regular basis. I never got to meet him. He was a basketball player who just got out of high school and was going to play college basketball. Anyway, that's, when I came home, you asked me about coming home. It was 22 days over and 22 hours flying home. We landed in Newark, New Jersey, and there were 4 of us that rented a car and drove back toward Boston. They lived all of us lived in New England. And came by the expressway in Boston. My parents lived about maybe a mile from the expressway right in Quincy line. So I got out with my duffel bag, and they continued up to Boston. And I said, oh, gee, I'll surprise my parents. So I'm walking home with my duffel bag. People are going by hollering at me because I was still in uniform. It was a year after I came home, I was walking down the street, and it was 4th of July, and the fireworks were going off, and I hit the street, hit in the gutter, and it was a response. It was a natural response. Today people come home with post-traumatic stress. I don't think you can understand the effect that can have on an individual. I don't think it lasted with me. I used to sleep with a survival knife under my pillow before I was married. I was coaching high school football, and we were at a camp up in New Hampshire, And I had the last tent in the camp, and I had the knife here. One of the coaches got up, and he tripped going out. He fell on my cot. I had him on the floor with a knife at his throat before he could exit. Fortunately, it stopped. Anyway, that's part of the story.
Was it difficult to readjust to your normal life?
It got to the point where, because I was still on active duty, I came back to New England. I had put in to go to Germany because I wanted to be in. I had 4 years of German in high school. I wanted to use it. I never got a chance. They sent me back to Massachusetts, to Fort Devens, and I was in charge of military police operations in New England. So that was an adjustment. And the hard part of that duty was that at that time, the draft dodgers, young guys that didn't want to go to Vietnam, that was part of our responsibility. And you'd see them and you'd bring them in and they'd have to be processed and go up to Maine and pick them up, bring them back. And I kept looking at these young kids that were or if they did something, they were in the military and they did something stupid in civilian life. They would not only be punished by the civilian court, they'd be punished by the military system. I didn't enjoy that at all. After I stopped wearing my uniform, I didn't get in many fights. But every time I wore the uniform someplace, somebody always tried to prove something that, well, you're in Vietnam, you're a soldier, you're supposed to be tough. So I learned real quick not to go places where I had to wear a uniform.
What do you wish you had never seen during war?
Wish that I had never seen? I wish I had never seen Dennis Guy Harmon get killed. Spend 2 days in the hospital with him. I wish I had never walked into a village of Vietnamese civilians that had been bombed. At one point I was on a road patrol about a quarter of a mile from a napalm strike and I got burnt all over my face. Those type of memories. You see things that at that time you never, like I said, when I taught high school, the kids had no idea what war was like or what Vietnam was like. And when I look back on it, a lot of the leadership, military, didn't have the right frame of mind because they weren't experienced in what a war was like. And a lot of civilians and a lot of mistakes were made because of that mentality. There were a lot of great leaders in the military, but a lot of the people that came from Washington that were in the military were making decisions that they didn't have a clue how to handle.
During your time in Vietnam, was there an experience that positively impacted you?
Positively impacted me. Yeah, it was. I can think of two of them. It was around holiday time, and you'd always get mail about a week or 2 weeks later. Christmas mail came 2 weeks after Christmas. And a ship pulled in, and we had to go out and inspect the ship, and I started climbing up the ladder. And it was a rope ladder. I don't know if you have rope ladders in school or not in high school, but they're called Jacob's ladders. So I got up near the top, and this head popped up. He said, "Hey, Kline, what are you doing here?" There was a kid that I went to high school who had gone to Mass Maritime, and he was a ship's officer. So every time the ship came in, it was maybe 2 or 3 more times, because we were eating sea rations. He'd have me at the ship for dinner. Call up, "Hey, we're in, come over for dinner," right? And he said, "Have you talked to home?" I said, "Gee, no, why?" He said, "Well, come on in, I'll get you a phone call from home, because we had no communication. So they had a process there where the ship could call from one place to California, from California to New York, from New York to Massachusetts. It got as far as New York. It was about 2 hours process, and the line goes dead. But the idea that I could, send a message it was a great thing. The Vietnamese people were so positive, and most of them, even they were farmers, were educated. The other thing that really bothered me after having been there, if you go to a foreign country, you should learn the language, or you should learn the culture. We never, ever learned any of the Vietnamese culture or any of the language at the time that I went. I think that changed later on. But when you walk into a Vietnamese village, to respect what they had, you had to understand their culture. And we would never, go in and win the war and come home. It was that same attitude they had after World War II and Korea, that, well, we have all the answers and we're the best soldiers in the world. And I've got some things over there, the rules of how to treat the Vietnamese people that were handed out by the government. They handed out all this good stuff that you're supposed to do, but they never taught you how to do it.
Did being in the military change your perspective of the war?
Yeah, it did. Because as growing up in the 60s, especially after World War II, Korea, if you'd see these movies, John Wayne, or all of the movies that came out were so positive about our effect on what happened in the wars and how well we fought them, and so as a kid, boy, the military is, and in the war, being there did not glorify it. War is an awful thing. And the people that suffer are not just the people that get killed, but on our side, but the people that get killed, the civilian population, takes an incredible toll. When you walk into a village and you see, mothers holding their babies, you don't know where the fathers are. Either they're out and left the village because the Viet Cong, or they were working for the Viet Cong but were forced into working for the Viet Cong, so when the troops came in, they'd leave. If they didn't leave, the Viet Cong would come back and take it on their families. It's an awful thing. Peace, there's got to be a way to work around peace. Or eliminate the unnecessary violence of war.
Looking back on all your experiences, were you grateful to have been a part of the military?
Yes, I was. I thought the military gave me a side of life that I was never exposed to. I had always thought the military code, duty, honor, country, was something that we should live by as a nation. And I would put before that family. There's nothing more important than family.
What do you think that kids should take from being in the war?
What should kids get from being in war? Hatred and violence, dedication to country. Um, the answer that you're given is not always the right answer. And just don't accept things that are presented to you as being factual or the best. Try to always look in depth and critically think about, and if you can, influence the train of thought. I think that's part of the problem with some of our education systems. We teach a lot of facts and figures, but we don't teach things like critical thinking. People are upset about diversification. I think that one of the problems with this country is that we aren't diversified. We can't go to another country. We can't, everything is here. So we don't learn about other cultures. And as far as bringing people into this country and worrying about illegal aliens, this country was built on aliens. But I think there's got to be a way to somehow screen the security of this country. And I wish I had an answer for it. Matter of fact, when I was teaching high school, one of the captains of my track team, he was a North Vietnamese. And I said, oh my God. And we sat down and talked, and there was no, he was a kid. He hadn't even been there, but his parents were there. And to learn that the large number of North Vietnamese that left the country, moved south to stay away from communism, the issue was we went in and I don't know that we did the right thing as far as not supporting. I think maybe we might have been better if we had not expected all the communists. The good thing that we did was prevent the flow of communism, if you think like Americans do, democracy, is to prevent the flow of communism to Cambodia, Laos,